What have we learned over the last few days? Well, government leaders and medical professionals have said, as it relates to the spread of the coronavirus, we need to slow it. How do we slow it? We got to shut down. We got to isolate. We got to self-quarantine.
Avoid gathering in groups of more than 10 people. Avoid discretionary travel. And avoid eating and drinking at bars, restaurants, and public food courts.
We saw the Federal Reserve and 5 central banks around the world in a coordinated effort slash interest rates. We're going to get into what that means in a second, but big picture, what does it say? It says that central banks understand that slowing the spread of the coronavirus is crippling economically. When we are told to stay home, we don't spend. We're freezing our economy. We're freezing its ability to grow. But at the same time, we've got to pay our bills. So let's talk about what the rate cut does. The rate cut makes it easier for banks to lend money. Unlike 2008, we don't yet have a systemic crisis. Banks are able to lend to borrowers and keep the system going. So by lowering rates, it enables banks to keep doing that. But also lowering rates helps individuals and small businesses. At a time like this, where you might have almost no income, but you still have employees to pay and you've still got rent to pay, you got to pay the bills. So lowering rates for small businesses means they can borrow. If you're saying I'm a small business owner, I don't know what to do, go to SBA.gov right now. That's the Small Business Association, and you can figure out what loans are possibly available to you. Now, what if you say, well, I'm just a worker. I'm a worker at a small business or a big business, and my business might be shutting down temporarily. Does a rate cut help me? Well, the rate cut doesn't help you, but your state might. So go to your state website right now, look up your state name, look for unemployment benefits. States like Ohio have changed their benefits so people who are quarantined, people whose businesses are temporarily shut down can apply for unemployment benefits. And now here's the third leg, a fiscal stimulus package. This is what Nancy Pelosi and Steve Mnuchin were working on Friday. It's what we're waiting for the Senate to pass. This is a big, giant package, and most likely we're going to get more than just this one that's going to inject money into the system to help people and businesses who are crippled right now. We know that the travel and leisure and airline industries, just to start, are being wiped out. They could need or be asking at least for some sort of bailout. But we also know this is crushing individuals. Lots of people cannot work from home. Or even if they're applying for unemployment benefits, that's usually 60 or 75% of regular pay. Or maybe you still have your job and your kids are now home from school. What we need right now is some emergency cash injected into the system. Now, it hasn't been approved in the most recent fiscal stimulus plan, but we've heard from former National Economic Advisor Jason Furman and others, this might be time to apply a universal basic income where we're basically sending a check to every single American.
Americans need cash now, and the president wants to get cash now. And I mean now, in the next 2 weeks.
Because as we tell people to stay home and be safe, a lot of people aren't doing that if they're worried they can't put food on the table. So we've got monetary policy from the Fed, and now we're waiting for that fiscal package, that fiscal stimulus to keep things afloat and keep people okay in this serious time of need.
Hey, NBC News viewers, thanks for checking out our YouTube channel. Subscribe by clicking on that button down here and click on any of the videos over here to watch the latest interviews, show highlights, and digital exclusives. Thanks for watching.